first contact with Joshua put.
All right, welcome back everybody. So for today, the topic is UFOs, and the particular UFO story I'm going to talk about is the story of Moses and the UFOs that occurred during the time of the Exodus. I chose this story because it is Passover, and we know the traditional story that we hear from the Bible, but the story is very popular in the UFO community because it has all the classic signs of UFO experience. So that being said, I found a couple of great sites that I want to introduce you to so you can check it out further. I'm sure you're very aware of these stories, but nonetheless, let's look further into them. All right, this site here is called thelightside.org. The Bible follows, following a cloud to Canaan. When Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, he certainly didn't do it alone. From the account recorded in the book of Exodus, it seems that he had a lot of help from above, and this help appeared in a very unordinary way. Now remember that when the history of that journey was recorded, the author didn't have modern words like UFO or even airplane to describe what was witnessed. Think about it. How would you describe a UFO if you couldn't use any modern words? I'd imagine you'd compare it to something that people would be familiar with. Even today, people refer to cigar-shaped or saucer-shaped UFOs. With this in mind, let's look at the first account of the strange object that appeared to lead the Israelites shortly after they had left Egypt. A passage from Exodus 13:21-22. But the day of the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So this object is described as a pillar, certainly a common visual picture for anyone who lived during that time. But what would we think today if we saw this object that is compared to a pillar of cloud and fire? Looking at the event from today's perspective, I think that a large object like this could move on its own would most likely be some type of vehicle. Given the lack of roads, this vehicle probably would have had to travel off the ground, either hovering or flying, to be this mobile. It's interesting how this object is described as a cloud during the day. You'll see this visualization used later in the story too. Do you think that maybe the craft actually used a smokescreen or mist to hide itself so it would appear less foreign to the people? Maybe the occupants were using this tactic to keep everyone as calm as possible as this huge group moved out of Egypt. As far as describing the object as a pillar of fire by night, how else would you describe an object that was illuminated if you weren't familiar with electric lights? This following event gives further evidence that this pillar was much more than just your average cloud. Exodus 14:19-20. Then the angel of the God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. It seems that the object was very mobile and also seemed to be under some kind of intelligent control. I wonder what the angel of God that is mentioned looked like. Do you think it might have been another smaller UFO? From what is recorded in the Exodus account, we really don't know for sure, but the description of its movements would make this a reasonable possibility. Now, if you're open to the possibility that craft was assigned to assist Moses as he led the Israelites out of Egypt, do you think it might have had something to do with this next event? This comes to us from Exodus 14, verses 21-29. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from this Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea in the daybreak, and the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and the horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now, I've had people ask me, if the UFO was doing all the work, why did Moses have to extend his arms? Why didn't it just fly over and do its thing instead of making it look like Moses was doing it? I think this was by design. Remember that if this object was a UFO, it was there to do the will of God. Since Moses was God's chosen representative to lead the people, the UFO was probably focused on providing technical backup for Moses, not to steal the show. In fact, this is exactly what Moses is told in a later passage. Exodus 19, verse 9. The Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud so that the people will hear me speaking with you and will always put their trust in you. Then Moses told the Lord what the people had said. Now, in a later account, the cloud is again involved in a miracle, as in the case of the parting of the Red Sea. I think it's entirely possible that the same craft helped out in the daily distribution of food to the Israelites. From Exodus 16, verses 10 through 15. While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in a cloud. The Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. As the journey goes on, there are a number of other references to God appearing in the cloud or using a cloud to perform certain tasks. Also from Exodus 19, verses 16 to 22. On the morning of the third day there was a thunder and lightning and a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like a smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, Go down and warn the people, so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them may perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. But why all the smoke and mirrors? I think it was simply for the purpose of making an impression on the people by giving them a visual demonstration of power. God gave the Israelites many new rules to follow, and he wanted them to know that this was serious, that he was serious. The following excerpt indicates that Moses also thought that this was the purpose. Exodus 20, 18 through 21. When the people saw the thunder and the lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But we do not have God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Yet another example of the cloud and fire being used to describe what the people saw. Exodus 24, 15 through 18. And Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain. On the seventh day the Lord called to Moses within the cloud. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. Then Moses entered the cloud as he went up on the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Another interesting aspect of the whole story is the Ten Commandments being inscribed on tablets of stone. This writing was apparently something like the people had never seen before, and Moses describes them as being inscribed by the finger of God, and the writing was the work of God. Exodus 31. When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him 2 tablets by the testimony, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. And then from Exodus 32, Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. Now I'm sure the content was from God and the engraving was done by the direction of God. But does God really have a finger that he writes with? If you look at this incident from the modern perspective, I think it's well within the realm of possibility that the same types of laser engraving that we see used to make very stone monuments could have been used to engrave the tablets. Of course, we no longer have the actual tablets available, so there's no way to know for sure, but looking at it from this perspective can often make the incident seem more real and believable to us. If we understand a little bit about how things might have been done, it's easier for us to see the whole event as being something that actually happened instead of just a myth or a fictional story. Now, I'd venture to guess that this craft ended up doing a lot more than the book of Exodus records. In fact, from the following passages, it seems that eventually the Israelites actually got kind of used to the craft being around. After a while, it was probably as common to them as airplanes are to anyone who lives near an airport. Okay, and this is from Exodus 40. Then Moses set up the courtyard around the tabernacle and altar and put up the curtain at the entrance of the courtyard. And so Moses finished the work. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel during all of their travels. All right, so that's a very good piece there. Here's another one. This is from UFO Digest. It's from a manuscript that someone has written. This is a portion of it in which let me read some of it here. Woe to us, who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with all manner of plague in the wilderness. One of the most well-known stories in the Old Testament is that of Moses. In my continuing communications with Armak, an extraterrestrial, he explains an entirely different version to the one written in the Bible. We will look at the story in the Old Testament along with Armak's version, stating that it was not God but extraterrestrials who brought about the plagues. Okay? So I'm going to leave this link available for you. Basically what he's talking about is similar to the other story in the concept of extraterrestrials, that this wasn't what we know as God as described in the Nag Hammadi I read yesterday, but this was more of a being that was traveling in a ship with other beings that were in the ship with him, and they were traveling and assisting the process. And it was they who were acting on behalf of God to be able to assist the Israelites on earth. So it's a very fascinating subject, very fascinating subject. Anybody who's been studying this UFO phenomena knows about this story. There's many, many more in the Bible. This is by far not the only one in the story. There's the story of Elijah. There's the stories of the birth of Jesus. There's lots of evidence and information around there that suggests extraterrestrial involvement, on and on and on. So this is one good story. I thought that during Passover this would be very appropriate. Go back, read through this. You can go back and reference the Bible passages that I read portions of. Go back and read it in its entirety and just kind of see what kind of meaning it takes on for you when you do it in that way. And that's it. That is our UFO news for today. That is the story of Moses, the UFOs, and the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. That's it.